Welcome everyone to this event hosted by the ARC North West Coast. Just a note, because I'm not sure that everybody saw in the chat, that we're recording this. We're recording the presentation so we can share with people who couldn't be here. But what we won't be doing is recording the breakout rooms so that then we can have those conversations. And I hope that everyone is okay with that. I hope that kind of makes sense. So a little bit about ARC, the Applied Research Collaboration North West Coast. We're a 5-year collaboration funded by the National Institute for Health Research, with alongside co-funding from our 60+ member organisations, and we're co-producing research and implementation projects along with our public advisors and communities, focused on reducing health inequalities in that health and social care space, with a mission to reach into communities, particularly where there is that greatest need. So today, what we're hoping to do is to think about how we can use evidence and research to support action on air pollution and health. And we want to share with you some of what we've been doing and see how this fits with your priorities and how you might want to work with us to take some of those priorities forward. So we've tried to bring together quite a wide audience so we can gain a wide perspective on what those priorities might be. So concerns about effects of air pollution on health are really not new. You know, back in medieval times, so 13th and 14th century, there were concerns about health of Londoners, and that prompted a ban on the burning of sea coal in London. At the mid-16th century, it was recognised that incidents of ill health was associated with coal burning and bad air. And in the Victorian era, the narrative was really about offensive emissions, nuisance from smoke, and pollution was largely then due to domestic fuel burning industry, with smoke and sulphur dioxide being those dominant pollutants. But I guess our worst recorded case of effects on health was the Great Smog in 1952, where up to, I think it was 8,000 related deaths occurred, and that led to legislation. So the Clean Air Act was established, and that brought in smoke-free zones in our urban areas and use of smokeless fuels as well. So I suppose more recently, transport has become the predominant source of pollutants in urban areas, particularly in urban areas. So particulates, oxides of nitrogen, ozone, carbon monoxide, lead, of course, which was present in petrol until fairly recently, benzene. And during the 1990s, new legislation was brought in to help protect the environment, and with that came requirements for a national and local government to develop air quality strategies and plans to reduce significant risks to health. So local authorities play a really important role here, and you know, it's great to have representation here, bringing local authority perspective to the issue. So we've also got, in the programme, we've also got some presentations on research that's been done to look at the effect of some of the tools that local authorities have to manage air quality, and also how communities have been engaged in action to improve air quality. And we've also got speakers bringing the perspective of clinicians working with patients affected by air pollution, as well as some members of the community as well. So I think we should move into the presentations now quite quickly. I think I've made up a little bit of time, but before handing over, just a little bit of etiquette. Please mute if you're not speaking. Just cancels out any feedback or annoying mobile phones that might come up. We've got a question and answer at the end of our presentation, so please use the chat for questions or raise your virtual hand at the end. After we've had that Q&A session, we'll have a break, and then we'll go into those breakout discussions, and then there'll be an opportunity to feedback and hopefully formulate some next steps. So I think the first thing then is, without any further ado, is first of all we're going to hear from Neil and Paul, who are two public advisors involved in an air quality review working group, and we're also going to see an animation which was made by the Better Old Swan group, one of the Clark Neighbourhoods for Learning, which chose as its focus the high streets, including air quality. So I think, Olga, if you're ready to play that presentation, please.
Hi, my name's Paul Moran. I'm part of the Air Quality Working Group. I live in Old Swan. I've lived in Old Swan for 15 years or so now. I've got two children who go to school in Old Swan. I work in Old Swan, and I run a local boxing club in Old Swan. I'm really invested in the area, and I'm really invested in kind of making the area better. Obviously, some concerns raised over the last few years about the air quality in Old Swan, particularly around the junction outside kind of Tesco's, one of the most polluted areas in the whole city. And we've got three of the main junctions, three of the main arteries really that go into Liverpool city centre, just on or going through Old Swan. So we've got Queen's Drive at the bottom, we've got Edge Lane at the top, and running right through we've got kind of Prescott Road, which goes directly into the city centre. The air quality isn't good. Over the last kind of couple of months, we've actually had a big water leak in the middle of Old Swan, and that made the air quality dramatically better. Funnily enough, there was lots of families enjoying walking around the area when obviously everything happened with COVID, but it was great to see kind of people going out and getting fresh air, even though there was other challenges out there that they were getting. But that really helped. You know, that road being closed, no traffic going down it, and it was actually a joy to be around the area at that time. It's a pity the shops weren't open, but yeah, it was definitely a change. Over the last kind of couple of years, we've noticed the traffic getting busier, and therefore probably the air quality getting worse. You know, I'm not too happy about it with kind of my children going to school right on that junction. You know, when they're going to school, when they come from school, and when they're playing in the playground, I'm sure they're taking in kind of toxins that they probably don't need to at that young age. I also run Old Swan Boxing Club, which is just a couple of 100 yards away from that junction. Obviously, we think we're doing the best for the children of the area by giving them, you know, fitness sessions and increasing their physical and mental well-being. But actually, are we doing the best thing for those kids by doing it at that particular junction, with all the toxins that they may be taking in, while doing the sessions as the cardio heavy sessions, and obviously, you know, they're going to be out of breath and taking more breaths in as they're doing those sessions. So happy to be involved in the working group, happy to be involved as a public advisor, and happy to kind of make some changes to make Old Swan a better area, not only in air quality but in everything that is happening in the area.
Hello, my name's Neil Joseph. I'm a public advisor, and I've been working with Arc North West Coast and the EPIC team for the past 18 months on air quality action planning for community engagement. The admittedly primitive graphic we are looking at stems from a conversation from my colleague and fellow public advisor, Paul Moran, who posed the question: when considering community engagement for an issue as ubiquitous as air quality, what's in it for me? The graphic portrays some of the most seldom heard or not heard at all voices from the population. Our loved ones, our elderly citizens and community who have mobility issues and travel in wheelchairs, our babies and children in pushchairs, and our pets, our cats and our dogs, are all at a street level, exactly parallel with car exhausts. When we consider air quality, it's worth bearing in mind Kissy, Deborah and her friends from Choked Up, who moved a landmark court case, the first of its kind, which attributed the tragic death of Kissy to air pollution in the area she lived in. When we talk about triple jeopardy, there could be no better example or tragic case than this. Thank you for looking at our presentation, and we hope you will move and consider that action is required.
The City of Liverpool encourages its residents to make a difference to air pollution by making responsible choices like turning engines off when parked or thinking about walking or using public transport. But residents can't control the cost of our public transport or pollution hotspots caused by traffic jams on our major roads. Residents from Old Swan recently created a working group called Better Old Swan and teamed up with local business and voluntary sector organisations to take the air pollution problems in our ward to researchers from Lancaster University, National Air Quality Testing Services and Liverpool Charity and Voluntary Service. Better Old Swan obtained NHS funding to study levels of indoor and outdoor air pollution in the area. We measured the air quality in 3 locations in February 2019. The study found that air pollution does not stop at the front door. It finds its way indoors. Yes, indoors. We spend 90% of our time indoors, and like most people, we think we are safe inside. But indoor air pollution is just as bad for health as outdoor pollution. Ultrafine particles from traffic find their way indoors and pose a significant health threat because they're invisible and so small that we can get deep inside our lungs. This can cause a range of health problems, including making heart and respiratory conditions worse and affecting thinking skills in children and older people. These particles are not part of normal air quality measurements, so there's little awareness of them at the moment around the dangers they pose.
But the good news is that Better Old Swan doesn't feel hopeless. We've started building links with professionals that can change the system to help solve the problem. But we now need more residents and professionals working in Old Swan to wake up and join us to demand changes to protect our air quality. So come on, get involved. Contact info@lcvs.org.uk and together we can make a difference.
Love that animation. I think it's really good and really snappy, and it was. I think what Neil and Paul had to say just really sets this workshop off far better than I could. So I think we should now go to introduce Fiona Ward, who's going to tell us about a piece of work that both Neil and Paul alluded to, actually, which is a review that we've done on engaging communities in addressing air quality.
Thanks, Jane. I'll share my screen now. So, is that okay? Can you see my screen? Yes, good, thanks. So as you've heard, air quality has been identified as an issue of concern in the Clark, and through resident conversations that we held early on in the applied research collaboration. So what we did during the early part of the first lockdown was to look at documents that were available on local authority websites to see what sort of community engagement there'd been across the region. We found there was a lot of advice given to members of the public in these documents and some consultation exercises, but we really wanted to find out about where communities have been more actively engaged in addressing air quality. So we decided to do a review of the literature. We looked at 39 different studies, 39 different studies. And sorry, my slides on.
I was just going to say, your slides have come off actually, they're not on the screen anymore.
Oh,
I need to just reshare.
There. Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So we looked at 39 different studies, and we found that there were various ways that communities have been engaged. Most of the projects were around citizen science, including monitoring and smell reporting, but there were other methods such as environmental and health assessments, education and training, and policy development and review. And this included work that took place in more disadvantaged communities as well. Oh dear. Right. Just a summary of some of the findings, because it was an extensive review, but things I thought you'd be particularly interested in. So the level and type of community engagement varied, but we found it was facilitated by a number of things in particular, including working with local community-based organisations that were known to and knowledgeable about their communities, having a dedicated multi-stakeholder steering group which provided an identity for the projects and underscored its importance, but also helped in the development of relationships, working in ways that was appropriate for particular communities and then adjusting methods where that was necessary, and community involvement throughout the piece of work. So it didn't have to be an issue identified by a particular community, but it had to be acknowledged as being of personal relevance to motivate involvement in the early stages. And then key challenges included language. So it is a technical subject, obviously, but it was about how this information was communicated and shared. And ideas included recruiting local residents who had scientific backgrounds and small group work as well. The capacity of the community members was also sometimes an issue. So it's a question of working around residents' work and family commitments, and possibly lack of internet access, particularly in monitoring projects. And sometimes a lack of trust, more likely to be identified as a barrier where residents were less extensively involved, but could be a result of long-standing issues. A lack of early involvement, so stakeholders who were involved in the early stages were seen to have a greater influence on the projects. And there were outcomes, positive outcomes for a range of organisations. So we found that intelligence gathered during the studies and more communication with residents resulted in better informed organisations. And in some cases, the lasting links were built. So organisations established further engagement opportunities. Several studies described the impact of the activities on policy and funding, and a range of changes in organisational practice were described. And also for individuals and communities, there was increased health, scientific and environmental knowledge and awareness, and the development of skills. There were personal impacts, including increased confidence and motivation to act, and the development of local connections and relationships. And quite often, individual or community empowerment was described as an outcome, but we felt this could probably be more usefully seen as a product of these other linked competencies. So just a few things we wanted to highlight thinking about our discussions later today. whilst we've been doing this work, clearly a lot's been happening, things have changed, and there's this Building Back Better agenda. So with the indication that people with health conditions linked to long-term exposure to air pollution have increased risks in terms of COVID-19, and also wider evidence that COVID has exacerbated existing inequalities in chronic disease and social determinants of health. And it's been suggested that public health needs to win the peace as well as the war. So is it useful to see air quality as part of this COVID recovery agenda? And on another front, a lot of local authorities have declared climate emergencies. So some of these have substantial community engagement. And is air quality part of this agenda where you live or work? In terms of the methods that we came across, it highlights the range of methods, the variety in different community contexts and with positive outcomes. But what we found was that awareness raising was the important first step to generate a common understanding of the causes of air quality, poor air quality, and also decision-making processes. So it'd be interesting to hear your experiences of community engagement. And then in terms of outcomes, it was often unclear in the studies, often unclear about how this community empowerment resulted in improved outcomes for health and air quality. So we'd benefit from a better understanding of this pathway. And then thinking about systems working, this work obviously needs organisational leadership to support relationship building, the development of sustainable solutions and community engagement. So we're talking about local government departments and other organisations developing collaborations that need to be maintained in the long term to see the outcomes on health and on air quality. So there are questions about capacity to collaborate, identifying communities who are interested in being involved in this work, and what would organisations need and communities need to be able to get involved in this sort of work. I want to acknowledge the members of the Air Quality Review Group who've been involved in this work as well. So it includes colleagues from Lancaster University, Liverpool City Council, Public Advisors, Regeneris, Blackburn with Darwin and Liverpool University as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. So I guess as a response then, we now have Ruth Livesey from Regeneris talking about a community-based organisation's perspective on air quality and health. Ruth.
Hi. Yeah, so just to explain, Regeneris, we're a social enterprise and we're based in Bootle, which obviously is an urban, for those of you that don't know, it's an urban, very industrial town and is right next to the docks. So between road traffic and shipping traffic and dock traffic, increasing the road traffic, arterial roads, we, like Old Swan, have very poor air quality. And it's an area, again, like Old Swan, with high levels of poverty, unemployment, ill health. And that includes poor mental health as well. So as a charity social enterprise, our mission is to improve the lives of people in South Sefton. And we do this by listening to the people that we work with and learning from our community and collaborating with them to make things happen. So we co-create community-led solutions. We support the process. We encourage the ideas and we work together. One of our key activities is Taking Roots, which is an umbrella for all our environmental activities. And it links together it's a bit of a movement really, rather than a network. We don't quite know how to describe it. But we linked together 50 different community growing projects across South Sefton. And we do that to share resources, to organise collective greening activities such as green corridor work, to promote the value of green spaces for health and well-being, but also to raise awareness of air quality and the role of the environment in carbon capture and reducing pollution. I felt it was easier to share an example project with you, so we've got a short video in a minute. Within a current project, this is a current project we're going to share, but within this project we're also going to be, or we are testing soil samples pre and during projects to see if there's any difference in carbon capture levels. I have to say it's a very small experimental test, so we're not overly optimistic we'll find a great change, but we're going to try. That's the beginning of our research approach to looking at carbon capture and air quality. And we're really interested within Taking Root and with our communities of developing a citizen-led carbon capture, carbon monitoring project based within all our community gardens. So that's kind of where we're looking going forward. The video is projects Head North for Beauty, Pollinators and Carbon Capture. It's a partnership project with local authorities, with our community and with housing associations. So we've got a big partnership, we're leading that project and everybody's chipping in different ways. And with Scouse Flower House, who you may have heard of, leading on our wonderful flower meadows across the Liverpool City region. So thank you for listening, and Olga, over to you, if you wouldn't mind queuing up my video.
Sure.
Oh, spring is amazing. It's one of my favourite times of the year. You know, days are longer, you get to go out in the garden and sow things, and sowing things is the best thing ever. So I always think sowing seed, especially with your friends and your community, is just something brilliant because you all get to enjoy this kind of magic.
It's showing what you can do with wildflower seed, transforming very simple grass landscapes into something much more special, which is full about diversity and connection to people, really.
And if you don't have lots of, you know, garden space or any outdoor space, then at least, you know, you've got some public spaces that we can beautify. So this is about the Bootle end of it, and then we're also doing some North Liverpool sites as well.
The important thing about these spots is it's working with housing associations like Riverside, Savini, Taurus, because they have their own kind of landscape crews, and it's like parks departments. So what we're doing across the board with this project is demonstrating how, you know, fairly standard landscaping can suddenly become very exciting and responsive to, you know, big issues like carbon. It's all on the street corner, ecological restoration. I think it's really interesting how, for example, almost like parks have been rediscovered. So people's eyes have been opened, and they're witnessing things like birds and butterflies and bees, and looking at the world in a different way.
We need to do it because biodiversity. There's also an element of carbon capture for all the sites. We've taken soil samples and we're working with John Moores University to get some data. You know, the whole environmental thing is quite a big issue now in terms of, you know, there's always been talk about plastic, there's been talk about air pollution recently. So I think carbon capture is another one in terms of making small steps to make a difference.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Ruth. I don't know if you wanted to say anything further.
Oh.
Are you all right?
Yes, please. Yeah, every time I press them, my video is going on. Yeah, I'd just like to say, because this is with support from the Liverpool City Region Community Environment Fund. So it's not that I'm particularly wanting to push them, but I would like to credit the investment in us, really, to allow us to do this. And a couple of people saying they'd like to see the end result. Our idea right at the beginning is about creating a mosaic of wildflower meadows. So this project is creating 11 new meadows, and we're just at the point of pulling together our map, because within a couple of weeks you'll really start to see the flowers coming into bloom, and we are encouraging people to head north, because it's the bit of Liverpool, North Liverpool and South Sefton, both areas that are very much overlooked. So it's about head north and follow the trail, and it's very much about urban wildflower meadows. Some of them are tucked away in the middle of housing estates, in the sorts of places you wouldn't expect. So we're bringing that beauty to people's doorsteps, bringing nature to people's doorsteps. So I'll put our website link in the chat, and then following that you should be able to pick up maps and the like. We haven't quite got the map on there, but you know, we're getting there. Actually, there is a link to a small map, just for information. I'll be quiet then.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So if we can move on to Ben Barr now, please, who's going to talk about what are the tools that local authorities have got to help them around improving air pollution, improving air quality in urban areas. Ben, are you ready?
Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed. We've got a screen of sorts. Okay, great.
Just see where.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, and is that moving forward properly?
Indeed, yes.
Good.
Yes,
okay, everything technical is working. And yeah, thanks, Jana. Thanks, Ruth. That was such a great example of actions that can be taken. And yeah, so I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing to kind of evaluate the impact of some of the actions that can be taken. Slightly drier presentation than the nice view of wildflower meadows. I feel like I should have put some more wildflower meadows in these slides. So I'm going to look at that. One of the things one of the actions that can be taken to sort of improve air quality is the introduction of these air quality management areas that different parts of the region have introduced over recent years, and look at some of the effects that those might have had on health outcomes, in particular admissions to hospital for respiratory conditions. So we know across the region, and this is just data for the Liverpool City region, but you find a sort of similar pattern across much of the northwest coast. We do have a much higher level of people with respiratory conditions than compared to the rest of the country, in particular COPD, so that's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and asthma, and we have relatively high rates of people being admitted to hospital each year for respiratory conditions. So about 28,000 people admitted each year in Liverpool City region. And when we look at the sort of patterns of air pollution across, and this is again just looking at the Liverpool City region, but you can find a similar thing across the northwest. On the left, you see the dark areas where there's sort of high levels of air pollution, and on the right, the darker areas are areas where there's a higher proportion of the population living with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and a lot of those things map over to each other. So basically, where we've got problems with air pollution, we've also got many more people living with respiratory diseases that both can be caused by the air pollution, but also can be, you know, people with COPD will be adversely affected by air pollution. So their conditions will be exacerbated by the air pollution in their neighbourhoods. So we carried out this study to look at whether declaring an area as an air quality management area between 2006 and 2016, whether that led to a reduction in respiratory admissions across the northwest, across the northwest coast area. So local authorities basically have to monitor the level of air pollution across their area, and if areas have higher than a certain threshold on those measures, then they have to declare it as an air quality management area. They then have to put together an action plan of interventions that they're putting in place to help improve air quality. But previously, no one's really looked at whether that's had an impact on people's health. So we identified all the areas across the northwest that had introduced these air quality management areas, and that the map on the left there shows the areas that have been declared air quality management areas in red. So that's, you know, a few areas scattered across Cumbria and Lancashire. The whole of Liverpool basically has been declared an air quality management area, and Paul and others will be able to give more details on that. We then compared the level of hospital admissions in those places before and after they were those air quality management areas were introduced, and then we matched them to similar areas that have similar levels of issues with air quality, but hadn't had air quality management areas introduced, but had similar patterns of respiratory disease and respiratory admissions. So we match them to similar areas, and then we compare the trend in respiratory admissions in those intervention areas, so the areas that introduced air quality management plans, to this kind of control group. And by comparing that, we get an estimate of what effect the introduction of those areas may have had on hospital admissions. So we'd hope to see that introducing those air quality management plans and improving air quality would then lead to a reduction in respiratory admissions. So working with the local authorities across the northwest, we identified what actions each local authority had introduced as part of their air quality management plans. So that could be anything from traffic management, reducing emissions from private vehicles, community engagement activities that we've heard of, routing traffic in a different way, improving cycling and walking and sort of green infrastructure. So quite a variety of activities that have taken place during that time period, with some places, having actions across all of those different areas and some focusing on specific things that were seen as a priority in those areas. And then when we look at the trend in hospital admissions, so the red line basically shows how hospital admissions were for respiratory conditions were increasing in the areas, in these intervention neighbourhoods, and the blue line is what was happening in the comparison or the control neighbourhoods. So across all of them, we basically see a general increase in admissions for respiratory conditions. But what we did see in the intervention areas is that after these air quality management areas were introduced, there was quite a marked reduction in respiratory admissions, and that appears to be potentially the effect of the air quality management areas improving air pollution. So overall, I mean, I won't go into this in too much detail, but basically from that analysis we can estimate what, how much did introducing one of these air quality management areas reduce hospital admissions, and it's we estimate that to be about 423 fewer admissions per 100,000 population, that is. So quite a large reduction in respiratory admissions appearing to result from the introduction of these air quality management areas. One of the important things is when we looked at that, comparing more and less deprived areas, so or more disadvantaged areas, using the index of multiple deprivation, found the effect on hospital admissions was greater in more deprived areas, which is one of the things that is particularly important with actions to improve air quality, is that because the issue is more of a problem in more deprived areas, or more disadvantaged areas, and things like respiratory conditions are also a bigger issue in those areas. Action on air quality can help reduce inequalities, and that's basically what our study shows. So just in conclusion, the introduction of these areas seems to have led to quite a marked reduction in respiratory admissions. The effect was greatest in the most disadvantaged areas, and this is really something that we need to try and ensure across the region, is that when we're looking at improving air quality, it shouldn't just be measured in terms of air pollution, but also in terms of health improvement, and that actions on air quality should be an important part of strategies to try and improve health, but also reduce demand on health services. As everyone will know, there's a huge pressure on health services at the moment, and this evidence suggests that improvements in air quality can help reduce that pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I mean, I was really pleased to be involved in that this study took place, and also to be involved in it, because I think it probably is one of the few studies that has looked at health outcome impacts of local authority management areas in that way. But I'm sure that Andrew Turner later on will be able to say a little bit more about that as well. So thanks, Ben. I think now we'll move to Ian Sinha from Sinha. Have I pronounced that correctly? Sorry, Ian. Who's a clinician at Alder Hey Children's Hospital, and to get a perspective on air quality and health from health organisations' perspective. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, hi. It's been a nice one. It's been very interesting to watch the videos and the talks, and thank you very much, Sarah, for the invitation to come along today. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay after my talk because I'm on a ward round, but it is a great opportunity to, I think, share what we see. So I'm a respiratory paediatrician. My whole career is focused on the respiratory health of children. Air pollution is something that we've been worried about and talking about for a long time. And over the last few years, I think we've seen a huge change in people's perception of what air pollution means, and the data that our public health colleagues produce is really important within that. I guess from my point of view, what we see in Liverpool is the map of inequalities across the UK is always the same, whatever health outcome you look at in children, and certainly for paediatric asthma, for paediatric chest infections like bronchiolitis, we are amongst the worst in the country consistently and quite severely. Over time, that's always been put down to issues around different types of coding and other such stuff that doesn't mean anything. Actually, what we're really seeing in Liverpool when we have children admit to hospital, a huge proportion of it, in my opinion, about 70 to 80% of what we see is simply just the manifestations of deprivation. And alongside that, what we're seeing is I think an increased recognition about the impact that air pollution might have on that. It was I think really important to hear what Ben was saying, that everybody suffers from air pollution. Absolutely, everybody will have problems from air pollution, but from my perspective, the urgency and the life-threatening effects of this is what's happening to the babies and children and young people of Liverpool. The reason I say that is quite simple, is that your lungs grow in childhood, particularly in your early years. Your lungs grow very rapidly, and then you enter adulthood and then everything goes downhill. Nothing works better in me now than it did 20 years ago, and our lungs are exactly the same. So how you enter adulthood from a respiratory point of view will determine when you die from your respiratory illness, and how you enter primary school will basically determine all of that. So what happens to children is crucial. We know that children are especially vulnerable to the effects of air pollution, so they're the right height to breathe traffic fumes. They breathe more air for their body weight than any other age range, so they take in more air. Their immune systems are still developing and probably do develop, I guess, until through mid-primary school, and so they are less well equipped to deal with the air pollutants and the inflammation that it causes and the swelling and damage that it causes to the airways. And finally, they I think are a particular risk because they have an entire life of living with the consequences of this air pollution. What we see in Liverpool mirrors what we see in other northern towns, and this is what comes from doing a respiratory clinic, is that we see unusual presentations. Children with asthma, for example, should all be atopic. They should all be covered in eczema. They should come from families that are covered in eczema, and their siblings should all be scratching their eyes from hay fever. We don't see that. We see a slightly unusual pattern of severe asthma, which doesn't always follow the inflammatory pathway that you might expect. And I'm currently involved with a community in Stoke who live near a landfill site, and having spoken to some of their families, the symptoms that their children are experiencing are also different to what you might expect. So I wouldn't necessarily say that air pollution just exacerbates asthma in people who've got asthma. I think it causes a particular type of respiratory problem, and whether we see that here in Alder Hey or whether our adult colleagues will see it at the Royal or Aintree in 35, 40 years time, I don't know, but it'll catch up with them at some point because of how vulnerable the airways are. So in response to a lot of that, we set up a clean air clinic. I think it's the first clean air clinic around. I don't know, but it's certainly the first in the UK. And we opened that, and we're already getting a flurry of referrals into it. And what we're thinking about within there is using data to identify the extent to which outdoor air pollution and indoor air quality is affecting individual children's health. but also empowering families to make changes within their own home and what they do, and also collecting, I think, those data such that we have some strong evidence to lean on people that can make change. We've kind of gone into it talking about air pollution as an injustice to children, which I firmly believe. And as Ben was saying, you know, there's a huge socioeconomic influence here. So we know from studies, and this sticks with us very much, that people in the most deprived areas make the least air pollution. They breathe the most air pollution. And it was very nice to see Ben's last couple of slides, because our perception and from the papers that I've seen, they benefit the least from any policies to tackle air pollution. And when we think about climate change and air pollution, I think we should absolutely be looking at this as something that's bad for everybody, but something that's disproportionately bad for children and mothers, and something that's even more disproportionately bad for those children and mothers who live in deprived areas. I think for me, one of the, as Sarah had mentioned in the invitation email, to think about research moving forward, I think there's probably two things. One is that we can collect more information to describe the problem if we want. I'm not sure of the value of doing that, because we know now that it's a problem, and observational research, when you actually need it to land, and I know this from writing medical reports for children who have died from asthma attacks, and I know the legal response that comes to this, which is, well, observational data. How do you know that an asthma attack in November, when the air pollution high, wasn't just related to viruses and cold air and this, that, and the other? And the more we go looking for data to show that air pollution is bad, the more time we're not spending on finding interventions that work. There's an urgency about this that needs action, and so I would say the top of the list is what are the interventions that can help, and how do we ensure that they don't in fact make air pollution worse in the most deprived areas? How do we also ensure that we do things that the people that are going to lose their jobs from things like this are the people that are on the lowest paid jobs? So this has to tie in with a bigger and broader look at workers' rights, mothers' rights, these kinds of things. I think for me the second key area is the intersection between air pollution and poor nutrition. So one of we can stick my so if you look at the Wirral, for example, there's a line down the middle, and this side is pretty affluent and that side is less affluent, but even within that there are pockets where health is really bad, and we know that there are staggering rates of child poverty in Liverpool. We know that there are unacceptable rates of food poverty and food insecurity in Liverpool, and we need to start considering the fact that when we think about the direct impact of air pollution on the lungs, a lot of it's driven by particular types of inflammation, including from a type of chemical called a free radical. Free radicals are really bad for you, really bad for you, and we know that berries and fresh fruit and vegetables, of all the things on the earth, are the best antioxidants out there. So the very children that need access to good nutrition to protect them from the air pollution that hopefully you guys are all going to sort out, but in the meantime, the very children that need access to those fruits and vegetables are the very children that are left behind. And I think that would be a really important thing to consider, that intersection between pollution and other aspects of healthy living. Access to green space. Again, this group in Stoke are saying our children can't play outside. Imagine a school where children can't go and play outside at playtime because they all come in with their eyes streaming and nosebleeds all across the classroom. This is insane that this is accepted, and so I think thinking through those aspects is important. And I guess the third area of research that we can absolutely utilize, and is a powerful message, is that we need to not just think about the short-term effects of this. For every paper that's published showing that the rates of PM2.5 or the levels of PM2.5 going up correlates with the rates of asthma admission in an area, will be accompanied by a paper showing that it didn't happen that way. And people will always tease apart, and it doesn't really matter. The point is that we can prevent children from having asthma attacks in the first place by a healthy environment and a healthy life. You know, I think thinking through the longer term, lifelong consequences of children breathing air pollution is a scarier prospect to me than children having short-term symptoms, which are troublesome and a manifestation of a problem. But the long-term killer here is when children are dying from COPD in their 40s, 50s, 60s. You know, and that I think is an important area that we need to create some narrative around, in my opinion.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Ian, and thank you for taking time out of your busy ward round to come and give us your perspective on the research you know you and your colleagues feel is needed to protect our health. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you, Ian.
So,
even though I'm going to leave you now, Sarah, is there going to be some minutes or some outcome of the discussion at the end?
Yeah,
I may well actually
try and synthesize it all and send it your way. Yeah.
I will try and log in again towards the end. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your morning if I don't see you.
Thank you so much, Ian. So Sarah, perhaps if you could now talk. I am conscious that we are going to run over time, which is awful chairing skills on my part. I'm really sorry, but I think actually the discussions that we've been having and the talks that we've been having, I'm hoping that people are finding them really interesting. So yeah, Sarah, I'll stop waffling.
Okay, I'll try and share. What am I doing here? That one.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so today I'm going to tell you about a study that used health and education data. So fortunately, it is an observational study. As Ian's just said, they aren't the greatest, but I'll tell you how we set out to assess the impact of air pollution on educational outcomes. And as Ian just said again, it would be really good to look for longer term impacts. And this is a fairly short term study, but I'm going to tell you the result right at the beginning and then tell you about what we did so you can see how good or bad you think it is. And so the result is that pollution made a difference to everyone, even after we adjusted for deprivation. So even so it had a detrimental impact on people's educational outcomes. These are kids sitting their GCSEs. So even if you don't think it's impacting you, I think poor air quality might be impacting our brains, which is quite a scary thought. And we don't know what the long-term impacts of this is going to be. So as we've said already this morning, most people know about the impact of pollution on cardio and respiratory health. But what people don't realise is that there's recent international literature reporting that air pollution impacts our cognition, our brains, and how we think. But studies have recruited participants for very in-depth tests on their cognition. So understandably, they're limited to quite small numbers of participants. And also the limitations of that design is that they've got a lack of long-term objective collection of health history and air quality data at the appropriate resolutions. So they haven't got them at the right times or in the right places. And it's particularly important to have the air pollution come before the outcome, so you can try and say that air pollution caused whatever outcome, such as the educational attainment. So the cross-sectional study that we did still had several limitations, but we did have the air pollution at the right time and at the right locations. And because we used routinely collected health data from people's GP visits, for example, symptoms and diagnoses of different things, we had a long history of treatment symptoms for asthma and hay fever. And we also use an educational outcome of GCSE results, and we use that as a substitute for the more in-depth cognitive tests. But this allowed us to include 18,000 pupils rather than, say, 100 or fewer. And so here is our participant flow diagram, and the most important number is the 18,000 at the bottom. So at the top here we removed several intentional people from our study because we only had data on air pollution for Cardiff. So this study was set in Wales and in Cardiff, a city that doesn't have very high air pollution at all, really. So that makes it more interesting and definitely applicable to many towns across the world. So we removed 63% of pupils who weren't sitting their GCSEs. And then we had a bit of missing data at the bottom of the chart here. We wanted to have 100% retention of pupils with GP records, but 13% of pupils in Cardiff were registered to a GP who didn't provide data to the Sale Data Bank, which is the big data bank where we had all the data. But in total, we had 18,000 pupils. So what we did was we gave our atmospheric scientists coordinates for 157,000 home and pupil locations for each address, and they modelled air pollutants at those locations and returned the hourly data to us. And the reason we did it at 157,000 locations was because we can't tell where the pupils live until we get into the data bank, because we can't have the location of where all the pupils live, because it's all been de-identified, all their names and addresses have been removed. So we do this work without ever knowing who the person is or where they live. But we do something called a split file data linkage. So the NHS organisation we work with actually does the linking for us. And then we link the homes and link those homes to the schools, and we use that to create tailor-made home and school exposure data for air pollution for each pupil. So here are a couple of annual summaries for a single pollutant from the first and last year of our cross-sectional study. So we went from 2009 to all the way through 2015. And we used the hourly data that the atmospheric scientists gave us to create sensible home and school times and locations for pupils. So we assigned them to school only from 9 AM till 3 PM on weekdays in term time. So we essentially calculated this homeschool combined exposure for each pupil. And we did that so most people are limited to actually just using the home location, for instance. So we've done something a little bit more interesting there. And eventually we whittled down the data to the 3-month period before they did their exams, so including the revision and exam period in April, May and June and July. Sorry, April, May and June. So what we were looking at was a fairly short-term impact of pollution on educational outcomes. Now, if I was going to critique this method as I go, I'll just mention that we didn't do enough checking of these estimates, so we don't have the proof that the air pollution was in fact at those levels, and that might undermine our study. So I'd like to involve some citizen scientists like Fiona mentioned earlier. So what we wanted to do was take into account any respiratory conditions for the pupils, because we thought that if they had hay fever, they might not do so well because they might be all bunged up during their revision time. And we also would like to point out that we used a capped point score, which was a combination of 8 GCSE examinations, including maths and English. And this is what we found. As I said at the beginning, this is our outcome for educational attainment, so the capped point score. And what we found was, so anything underneath that dotted line is bad for the pupils. Basically, they did worse at their GCSEs. So that's about half a GCSE grade overall reduced. So it sounds quite small, but we've actually taken into account already their deprivation, area level deprivation, and the fact if they're eligible for free school meals, which is an extra measure of deprivation at the household, which is really quite useful for taking into account deprivation, because it often changes quite rapidly, even within a small area. So having more nitrogen dioxide meant that these pupils were doing worse in their GCSEs, and I think this has could have a big effect on the pupils, because they're already disadvantaged by having by living in a deprived area, so that has a big effect. So this is on top of that effect, and it might mean they miss out on college, going to colleges, because they don't get the maths and English scores that they need to go on to further education or get a job. So it could have a long-term impact on their life chances. So here's some of the strengths and limitations of the study, and I guess I started out thinking I'd like to repeat this study up in the Northwest Coast area with some new data, but of course the school absences and attendances over the last year have been very severely disrupted, so I don't think we can do that. And I guess Ben has already done the study on emergency hospital admissions, but I think if we look at the emergency hospital admissions only, we're missing out on all the more subtle effects that could be happening earlier, such as their educational attainment. So it's a bit of a trade-off. And what I really would like to do is to get the kids to wear air pollution monitors as they travel to school. So mainly to show that the parents, my hypothesis is that they'd be breathing in as much, if not more, pollution while in the car, as opposed to walking or cycling along the back streets to school. So I'd be interested in hearing about this in the breakout room discussions this afternoon. And that's all from me. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. So if we could now go on to Paul Farrell, please, who's going to give us a local authority perspective on air quality and health. Paul, are you there?
I should be.
Brilliant.
Just bear with me. Yeah, there you go. Thanks, guys. I'm just
Hi, Paul.
Hi, thanks for this. I'm just going to set my timer so I don't waffle on. There we go.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invite today, Jane. And really interesting, as always, to hear different perspectives from whether it be from universities, whether it be from practitioners, members of the public. It's really, really interesting. And air quality is, for me, for my money, has finally got the kind of exposure, pardon the pun, that's been sadly lacking for the last 10, 15 years. We've all known about it for a long, long time, as I think you said in the introduction. I was involved very minorly in the paper that Ben Barr talked about before, about AQMAs. And I just did a quick review of that on behalf of the author. I think it was Tanith Rose. Just on that, Ben mentioned about AQMAs. Liverpool is an AQMA for the whole of the city, and that was simply because when you monitor air quality on a regular basis, as soon as you get a hotspot, you have to do further analysis of the hotspot, and once it's confirmed, you have to declare an AQMA just for that small geographic area. Now, Liverpool originally had 2. Then there were another 6 that were going to probably happen, then another 6 on top of that. So you could end up with 14 individual AQMAs that would all need to have further detailed analysis. Then you'd have to revoke them as they improved, hopefully. It would just become so bureaucratic and cumbersome. It was a decision taken that we would declare the whole of the city. And part of that for me as well is that air, unlike water pollution, for instance, you have a defined source and it discharges into a defined location. Air quality knows no boundaries. So there's air quality in Liverpool, that poor air quality, which is a result of local pollution. There is regional pollution, there is national pollution, and there is international pollution. We have high levels of ozone in the summer months. We know that they come from the Balearics, such as Spain and France and Portugal. So it's very difficult to pin down, if you like. So that's why we decided to go down the air quality management route for the area for the whole of the city. But I just wanted to touch briefly, if we could, on 4 points. And this was in discussion with with Fiona when she kindly asked me to speak. The first one was about poor air quality, and what does it mean? Well, from our perspective, what it means is the obvious ones, which is people are breathing in that poor air quality, and people are more erudite than me have explained what impact that has, and that was Ian Sinner before, for instance. But that is the main concern that we have as a local authority, is we know that it has an impact on people's physical and mental health and well-being, and that in turn then affects the ability of the city to grow, and that's grow socially, economically, attracting with investment. You know, the built environment and the environment in which you live is significantly attractive to people. I think if you did a study of organisations when they're looking to relocate or open new branches of whatever business they're in, they're really interested on what facilities does the town or the city have, what green space does it have, what's the schooling like, and increasingly things like air quality are going to become more important. People, I believe, will look to buy property in areas where they'll look at what's the air quality like. You know, you do searches, you get estate agents and solicitors looking at where there were former mines or radon gas, for instance, and I can see uncontaminated land. I can see air quality becoming a part of the package, if you like, that people want to consider. So it's really important for us as the council to try and improve the wealth of the city, and that's not just material wealth, but health of those who are already living there, but then attracting with investment. We want the city to grow because, you know, we're economically strapped, as everyone knows. So hopefully, you know, that's the kind of thing in terms of poor air quality and what it means. In terms of current priorities, from my own personal point of view, I'm the air quality lead for the Clean Air Plan. Liverpool's in the third wave of local authorities that have been mandated by government to improve air quality in the shortest possible time. So the first thing we've had to do is do a comprehensive review of existing air quality. And the focus has only been around nitrogen dioxide, because that's the parameter that that's the parameter that we failed to meet the required standard. Particulates, we know, is a big issue. And once we hopefully get on top of nitrogen dioxide, we know that the next one is going to be particulate matter. And the World Health Organization are correct. There is no safe limit for PM 2.5s or 10s. So we know that that's coming along. So the priority for us is to review existing air quality, which we've now done. We've done a comprehensive transport and air quality modelling. And we know that going forward, it is likely that we're going to have 18 road links in the city that will exceed the 40 micrograms per metre cube as an annual mean. But and the government, Client Earth as well, everyone hopefully on this call will know about clean air zones, and everyone's saying it's the panacea, if you put clean air zones in everywhere, everything will be fine. I don't actually agree with that. I don't think there's the technical evidence to support it. It's a physical engineered intervention. It'll only work for so long, and then air quality will improve to a point where you'll be taking it back out again. It's millions of pounds. And what we're looking at is, as long as we've got to look at that as a baseline. The government have said, look, that's the baseline. We believe that's the answer. So we're not just looking at a clean air zone, a charging clean air zone. We're looking at other interventions, or, you know, stuff such as alternative modes of transport, improving links to public transport, cycling, walking. This has been said for so many years, but we've got to try and make it happen. Talk is cheap. It's really encouraging with all the different participants on this. I think what we need going forward, for instance, is closer links, that we don't reinvent the wheel, that we learn what's already going on at academic level. We know what it's like to be as a practitioner. Sometimes things in theory work fantastically well. It's different on the ground. It's engaging with the public. Kids are great change agents. Working with the schools is seriously important. Reducing traffic around schools. I mean, I still can't believe in the world we live in that, you know, I live in South Liverpool, and school near me, there's dozens and dozens of parents there every morning, queuing in the traffic, dropping the kids off. So I think in terms of concerns, it's how do you take it from, I think it was Ian said it before, but also it was also mentioned about, monitoring is only a very, very small part of it. Once we meet, for instance, 40 micrograms, what does it mean? It's an arbitrary figure. It's a tick box, if you like. What impact does that have on people's health? What if we get to 35? What if we get to 30? What impact does that have? And I don't think there's been enough relationship between what we do as a local authority and the health impacts, and the closer ties of working with public health, for instance. It's got to happen. That paper about AQMAs, it just shows what value you can get from doing that kind of research. And I think one thing we're doing is we're about to do and this will be interesting for Old Swan. I think, is there a school St Vincent's in Old Swan? I think there's a St Vincent's. We're looking at 4 schools to do a programme with it's funded by government. We got £130,000 through the air quality grant, and we're due to start September. There's going to be four schools in 2 tranches, where it's a combination of they'll be wearing backpacks, some of the kids, monitoring real-time particulate monitoring. We're going to have 12 sensors, fixed sensors in these 4 schools, 3 in each, where we're going to be monitoring background PM levels. We're going to be looking at AM and PM peaks when you've got your drop off and your pickup. What's it like intermediate peak when there's not as much traffic about? Let's see if we can see what that shows. And then it's a part about awareness and raising awareness of the kids, behavioural change, citizen science at its best, if you like. And it's with Imperial College. There's a previous trial been done in London. So that's a really, I think, what we want to try and do is show the value of that, and then hopefully get engagement on a wider scale. So I think St Vincent's is one of the 4 that we've identified. We're trying to obviously include schools which are close to busy junctions, heavy traffic, where we get the biggest bang for the buck, if you like. So that's something else we're doing. And I do think, one thing I was asked by Fiona was about research and information gaps. And again, I do think there is a gap between monitoring air quality, whatever the pollutant is, and what impact that actually having. What Sarah just touched on around the work in Cardiff, I think it needs more of that. You need to understand what you need to tie in. If you have people not presenting as much at a GP, or then with mild symptoms not having to be hospitalised, what is the cost saving to the NHS against the cost of, for instance, if you had, we've had in the past a trial with CRC, Chemist Research, looking at informing people, those who are most vulnerable, COPD, asthma, letting them know when there's a pollution event likely to occur. It's predictive modelling, and they can then make a decision on whether they change their routine. They're not going to be exposed as much. We did a trial of about 120 people, which were people with asthma, COPD, and it worked really, really well. The feedback we got from them was it really made them think about their condition and how to manage it. So for me, I know it's been done in London, which usually is the case. For us, it's about trying to get the message out in a better way than what we've done in the past, trying to educate people better, trying to inform people to make their own decisions, how we get that out on social media, getting our website in the council so it's more user friendly. But for me, the big thing is tying it all in together, tying it into what we do at University of Liverpool, tying what we're doing with NWARC, with the public advisors such as Neil and Paul. So I just think it's really, really encouraging, and we just need to kind of focus it, pull it together and kick on. So I know I've rushed through that kind of, so,
Great.
But
Thanks,
hopefully you
Paul.
found that useful.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks for taking time out today.
It's okay.
So our final presentation then, Andrew Turner, who's going to talk about local air quality decision making and the processes around that. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. I shall share my screen. Can anyone not see that?
That's great. Thank you, Andrew.
Amazing. Yeah, so I'm Andrew Turner. I'm a researcher in Arc West. So that's one of the other arcs in the country. We're based out of Bristol, and our patch, if you like, where we sort of do most of our work, spans from kind of Gloucester down to Wiltshire, and then from Swindon across to Somerset. So that's the area in which the study I'm going to talk about takes place. And so this project I'm going to talk about, Clearways, is a project all about air quality and transport. And it's, air quality and transport is something clearly on your agenda. It's on the agenda in our region too, and our partners have identified this as something important that we should be looking into. I thought it was really interesting that Paul mentioned about the government mandated clean air plans. Of course, that's happened here in the southwest as well. So both Bristol and Bath have been told to put those clean air plans in place, and they've both decided to solve that problem by implementing clean air zones in the city centres. So that's, these issues are important nationally, really, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, the project itself. So our angle on this, and what we're really interested in, is how local authorities are making decisions about the kinds of interventions they're putting in place to improve air quality, and also about how air quality fits into decisions about other interventions more generally around transport. So, we're interested in what evidence is used to make those decisions, how's it gathered, and then how's that integrated with all the other competing priorities that inform, why a particular transport change is put in place. The study itself is divided into two phases. Phase 1's ongoing at the moment, and phase 2 is planned for the sort of near future. That first phase is a qualitative study, really to explore kind of how local authorities work. So we're interviewing staff from the 7 local authorities in our region. So far, we've interviewed 16 officers from different sorts of departments. So we're trying to talk to people from a range of different departments. That includes public health, air quality teams specifically, and also people from kind of infrastructure, transport planning. We may, we've got the ambition to interview councillors as well, and we'll see how that works. The elections in May, made that a little bit trickier than it would have been to do at the time we wanted to do. But trying to get as many different kind of perspectives on how local authorities make decisions as possible. So that's what we've done so far. And then in the next phase of the project, which is still fairly open as to what that might look like, we want to do some sort of interviews with different members of the public, campaign activist groups that are interested in these air quality issues, to try and get that perspective too. Okay, I can share some fairly early findings from those first phase of interviews. So that's the interviews with local authority officers. This is early days though, so we've only just started the analysis, and a lot of this is kind of impressions from the interview rather than anything more formal than that. But fundamentally, I think the way this kind of breaks down is, air quality decisions are made in different sorts of contexts. So you've got the sort of things that Paul was talking about, and Ben as well, where things are very compliance focused. So that's this the sort of the regime set up by the Environment Act, where you do monitoring. If there's a problem, you declare an air quality management area. You come up with an action plan that addresses those problems, and that sometimes is quite fenced off from wider integration of air quality in other parts of the council. So those two different contexts for decision making are quite important, I think, and they affect the relative priority of air quality in different sorts of decisions. Another really key aspect of decision making is, of course, the resources that are available. I came to this perhaps a little bit naively about how local authorities work, but I was really fascinated that often the air quality action plans don't have attached to them their own resources for implementing their recommendations. So a lot of how changes on the ground happen is reliant on air quality teams talking to transport teams, finding kind of mutually beneficial ways to tap into pots of funding to do specific work, on the back of something else, or searching for those mutually beneficial ways of working rather than having money to do a specific air quality project. So I think that's really critical. And then finally, another really key aspect to how decisions get made is in many local authorities, the way that teams work together can often be very informal. There's a lot of kind of influencing needed to get air quality on the agendas of different teams, and it's reliant on people with particular ambitions or personal relationships that already exist, rather than kind of formalized mechanisms and steering groups set up to get all the right people around the table. That seemed to be relatively rarer, certainly in our region. So again, I think that's a very important part of how decisions get made and how things actually get actioned and happen. Okay, that's the interviews. In parallel with that, and sort of as a precursor to that second phase, so that's the interviews that we've got planned with public and community groups, activist groups. So we've held basically one workshop so far to try and get a sense of what the concerns and priorities of members of the public are around air quality. I won't say too much about this. I'm conscious that I should keep this mercifully short. But key themes from there really resonate really strongly with the sorts of things that Fiona was talking about at the very beginning. So the importance of a real strong desire from members of the public for more information, greater engagement about what they can do and how they can influence change, and also trying to find ways to ensure that changes that local authorities or other organisations might want to make actually support communities that already exist and build on infrastructure that's possibly already there and improving it rather than doing something radically different. Okay, so that's that. And then to say a little bit more about this second phase. So obviously that second phase will be informed by the work we've done to date and also input from sort of our different partners. The nature and scope of that's still open, and one thing that I think it would be really useful to get from some of the breakout rooms is your input as well on what sort of different angles we could perhaps explore with this. At the moment, our current thinking is kind of around public views on what should local authorities take into account when making changes that are either air quality specific or have some kind of dimension, and air quality has an impact on those changes, and also how the public should be included in decision making. Other ways to perhaps improve that or change that to make that engagement stronger and better for everyone. There we go. That was a bit swift, but that's the project. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming over all the way from Bristol.
Pleasure.
And I think that's done a really nice tie up from the rest of the presentations actually. So